for them. Sorry, I'm recording and I just now remembered. So we are recording to the cloud. Catlin, I remembered. So this really is meant to be also like a thought-provoking training, a refresher, more than necessarily a teaching tool. Based on our chat discussion, there is a wealth of knowledge in this room. And so this is really meant to get everybody kind of on the same page and have us look at things through this kind of lens of harm reduction. And I invite you all to use this platform as a way to build kind of your professional and personal networks. And as we go on, Anne and Catlin are going to be monitoring the chat and the Q&A section. So yeah, here we go. All right, there's a whole bunch of objectives. I won't read them all to you, but hopefully by the time we're done, we will get a few of these accomplished for you all. So in the past training, we expanded the definition of harm from overdose and withdrawal and HIV and STI transmission to kind of all of the many negative outcomes that happen as a result of drugs and alcohol, but also mental health decompensation. And that's kind of what we made as behavioral health harm reduction. And this training builds upon that kind of broader definition of harm. And so I kind of think harm reduction is now less of a strategy and more a lens through which we kind of observe our clients and our work with them. And so when we think of harm reduction in housing, we want to think of like the bad and scary things that can happen to folks and what we can do to stop it, slow it down, or make it happen less. So these are kind of the expanded definition of harm: hospitalization, lack of safety, loss of access, a decrease in functioning, and death. These are kind of harm in a general sense that we want to be looking at. So now we'll cover kind of the major theories and concepts related to housing. Hopefully these will all be reviewed. So first is housing is healthcare. We know that it is really, really hard to maintain physical wellness and maintain health and manage chronic or acute conditions if you are unhoused. So healthcare is kind of a base intervention for improving physical health. Housing first. Housing is offered before engagement and treatment and not the other way around. Motivational interviewing, the stages of change, kind of the trans theoretical model is a really core concept into supporting people with how they think about housing and how they want to engage once they're in housing. Self-determination and autonomy also fall into that stages of change and in the way you work with people, right? Our clients are going to make decisions based on what's important to them, and it's our obligation to allow them to let us know what those values are and help us kind of align our interventions with what works for our clients. In that same vein, we want to think about empowerment and really helping the clients get power and control over the decisions that impact their housing, because if we're making decisions that aren't in line with what our clients are thinking or feeling or desiring, it's unlikely that they're going to be as successful as they could versus if we line up. And then compassion folds right into being trauma informed. And so really thinking about authenticity and consistency and compassion, because housing is not just about putting someone in four walls. It's kind of about a lot more than that. And we'll cover that in a second. So here's the kind of statistics charts thing we were talking about. I'm just going to direct you guys to the far right of this slide that just talks about homelessness in San Francisco. This is from the homelessness and supportive housing point in time count that they do every year. They didn't do it in 2020 because of COVID, but they did it in 2019. And so 2019, there were 8,011 unhoused folks in San Francisco. Of those, 2,831 were living in shelters. And you'll see that this number is higher than the past 6 years. So there's been an increase in people both in shelters and homeless in the city. These next few slides are from the San Francisco Planning Department. So they did a big study and released, their findings in July 2018 on housing needs and trends. And so this slide basically shows the change in the demographics of San Francisco from the 90s to 2015 and from the Bay Area from 1990 to 2015. And essentially this slide says San Francisco has gotten a lot more diverse. And so the non-white population has increased both in San Francisco and the Bay Area. And then these slides show that the majority of San Francisco seniors own versus rent, and the demographics it's a mix of API and white, so roughly like 30% each in San Francisco, with less Latino and Black folks. And then within that population, folks tend to live with relatives or as a couple. And then income wise, roughly 30% of the senior population in San Francisco make less than 30% of the area median income. And this is normally what people ask about the slides. You will get the slides. Don't worry if you don't see all the detail in that, you'll get these later. And these are all charts about the San Francisco disabled population. And so the San Francisco disabled population tends to be overwhelmingly seniors, and almost 40% of that group make less than the 30% area median income, and are a pretty even mix of Asian Pacific Islanders and white, followed by a smaller proportion of Latino and Black. And so that's the people in San Francisco, according to the planning department, that have a disability. And this is a slide talking about the affordable housing stock in San Francisco. And so essentially this says that access to affordable housing is limited, which I think we already knew, but this is objective information supporting that. And it's also showing that affordable housing is centralized just to a few major places in the city. So specifically, there's 5 neighborhoods in the eastern part of San Francisco have 60% of all of the affordable units. So that those neighborhoods being the Tenderloin, South of Market, Western Addition, Baby Hunters Point, and the Mission. So when we're thinking about housing and housing retention and how to get people to a place they might be able to afford, this is a good thing to know, because you're going to want to let them know that those are the options so that they can see if that's an option, a place that they want to live. And these are kind of like the major observations from the planning department. And so it says San Francisco has gained high income households, while the number of low and moderate income households has dropped, with the exception of extremely low income households, which has grown slightly. Higher income households have occupied a larger share of existing housing, as the growth in their numbers substantially exceeded new housing produced. And housing cost burdens worsened for all but the highest income household. Then demographic-wise, San Francisco has undergone additional demographic changes, along with changes in households by income, including loss of the Black population and households with children. Housing cost burdens and overcrowding are more likely to impact people of color, and households with children are also particularly impacted by overcrowding. And so this kind of, all of these helps us see who we might be working with when we're working on housing retention or optimizing people's housing options, and what kind of situations they're living in. Kind of helps us point our folks in the right direction. All right, like I said, elephant's going to pop up a couple more times, but those are kind of the theories and kind of the overall theoretical concept and kind of statistics. And so we'll move now to knowing your client and assessing kind of for your housing strengths and needs for your specific client, and talking about an assessment for housing fit. And we'll have a little discussion part now. So before we kind of get into discussing of how best to assess your clients and support their journey from homelessness into housing, or from one housing to a different type of housing, let's kind of talk about what home means. So home means safety and security, dignity, privacy, and also a reevaluation of success. So let's talk a little bit more about that. So please respond in the chat with your definition of success in housing. I'd like to kind of hear what people think about that.
Stability.
Yeah.
Consistent quality. Safety, comfort, stable rent, otherwise, sobriety, affordability, self-sufficient, privacy, affordability, autonomy and independence, sense of community and dignity, support,
Awesome.
safety, stability, yeah. Flourishing, of course, that's a good one. Housing that creates safety, the sense of dignity, stable income,
Yeah.
running water and heater, being able to balance income with your expenses.
Awesome. Yeah, I think all of those are
Clean,
great. And
no mold.
yeah, I also, yeah, you guys have brought up more things than I even thought of. And a couple things I wanted to add was that, success is defined by the client and not us. Looks like we're all kind of on the same page around dignity and safety. And
Supporting management too, that's the other one.
yeah, support. Yeah, right. I said success, it might mean permanent housing, but it might mean living on the street. And it may mean an increase in, I heard someone say stability and safety and security. And all those things may increase, if only for a little bit. And that's also reducing harm. And, that's all harm reduction, right? Finding what aspects of a situation you and your client can change together around their housing and kind of making it happen. Awesome. Thanks. So now we'll talk about the kind of skills of housing harm reduction. So first, we want to assess your client's skills and their challenges and their needs. And then connect them with kind of relevant housing options. And then support. So support the client's housing retention. And that also means linking your client to supports that they need. All right, so this is the harm reduction assessment. If you were with us for the behavioral health harm reduction training, this should look familiar because this is the exact same slide. And so this is essentially the assessment that you would start with when you were doing your kind of housing assessment. And so with this is kind of a thorough assessment that ties all of the kind of tools that we learned before about your orientation and your client's substance use and any mental health symptoms or kind of behavioral problems. You kind of put those together and identify what challenges your client has because of the specific mental health or substance use or medical issues. And then the needs that they have in their home or wherever they're at and the strengths that they have. So we covered in the last training the kind of needs of the homeless and formerly homeless population, but I will briefly run through the things you might come up with here because you'll see them in housing too. So there's psychiatric symptoms and severity. There's danger to self and danger to others. There's behavioral problems like impulse control. There's difficulties meeting basic needs. So that's like not being able to find clothing or bathe yourself or take care of food. Being on the street can be an issue people have, obviously. Substance abuse and dependence. Then people might have issues with social and family roles or be really isolated. I think COVID has really amped up the isolation for everyone, but especially for folks that were already isolated. And medical and health problems come up a lot for everybody, but especially folks that are unhoused, because it's kind of hard to manage medical conditions if you're not in a stable place. And then last two is criminal involvement and employment issues. So that covers all of the things that people might deal with. Yeah, and so then part of getting kind of a clear picture of what your client's going to need in housing to be successful is identifying what skills your client has, or what skills they don't have, and basically what things they're going to need support with on good days and bad days. And so this is a fairly exhaustive list of what we call IDLs or independent living skills, and kind of be a good metric for identifying the supports that your client's going to need to be safe wherever they are, but especially in housing. So shameless plug here. I work for IOA, and Institute on Aging has services that can help people with basically everything on this list. So if you have a client that needs something, you can call our intake line at 415-750-4111. Additionally, the Department of Aging and Adult Services has a resource hub at 355-6700 for all services through DOS, including case management. And for housing harm reduction and any other type of harm reduction, you want to make sure you're taking care of the basics first, making sure your clients have food, medication, hygiene, and safety. So that's kind of taking care of the basics. And it's part of your kind of assessment skill and figuring out what your client has and what they need. So this next thing is kind of an assessment that I made to really open the conversation with your client around what housing is going to work for them, what housing options are going to most support them where they're at, kind of regardless of where they're at. And I got this little picture of a scale because trade-offs, I think, is something that is good to remember and think about when you're thinking about housing. Each option that's available in housing has lots of benefits, and many of those benefits come with drawbacks. And it's important to know what the pros and cons are so that you can be really honest with a client about them. Because I think that's a good way to kind of work in that trauma-informed consistency and authenticity, is being honest with people about what they have access to and what that might kind of cost. So the 3 questions are: where do you want to be? What do you want to have access to? And what will you agree to? And I will go through the list of the options, and we'll kind of talk through the pros and cons. And so I think I talked about this already, like each housing option has benefits and each has drawbacks. And it's important to kind of be clear about what both sides are so that you can give your client the best chance of pursuing an option that's going to work best for them. And this is kind of where self-determination, transparency, compassion, and autonomy play a really big role, right? You want to make sure you're putting a client at the most appropriate level of support so that they have what they need when things go bad or if things go badly. All right, so if we look at first, where do you want to be? You want to look at, in your conversation with your client, is there a neighborhood they feel most comfortable in? I know we said back earlier that there's only kind of a few neighborhoods that have a lot of affordable housing, but it's still a good place to start with your client around what place do they feel safe in San Francisco? You know, where would they like to pursue housing? Is it close to a medical or a psychiatric clinic that they go to? Is it close to family or social contacts, places that they like to go? Maybe they have a 12-step group that they want to be nearby. Or is it close to a financial place, right? If people have a payee that they need to go to, you know, once a month or once a week, do they want to live somewhere close to there? Next is, what do you want to have access to? And like I said, this is where I think there's a real trade-off on having access to lots of things and maybe having to put up with some stuff. So if we look at PSH, that's PSH, permanent supportive housing. And permanent supportive housing is like a really strong, high level of care for folks. And at the most kind of the most kind of high service, permanent supportive housing is apartment building where everyone has their own individual apartment. There is social work in the building, money management, sometimes nursing also on site where they can manage your medication for you. So lots of on-site service, you know, Monday to Friday, 9 to 5, access to all types of support. An SRO is another level where people will have shared bathrooms, shared kitchens. Some SROs have social work on site, some don't. People might also want to live in a transitional housing, right? They might not be interested in permanent stuff, but want to kind of give housing a try in a kind of temporary or time limited fashion. And so that could be through Health Right or Progress Foundation or a sober living environment. An RCF is RCF residential care facility. That is where people will get their laundry completed for them. They will manage medication, provide supervision, and support with activities of daily living, but it's not a nursing home. And then BMR is below market rate. So that's all of those lists of affordable housing that you can apply for and it's kind of a challenging kind of thing to figure out, but people might want to live on their own and just pay less money. And then there are other options like a shelter, a navigation center, or living on the street. And those are all housing options that don't offer support, but offer a lot of freedom. And then finally, what will you agree to? Like I said, each of these housing options has things that might be required of the client if they're going to live there. So there might be house rules, there might be a requirement for sobriety, there might be a fee structure of some part. So like some residential programs will require fees. Most places will require some form of rent. And then with rent can come requiring for a payee or someone to pay bills for them. And then a lot of those housing options will have restrictions on visitor access or access to the building in general, or restrictions on the number of people they can have come stay with them or stay overnight. And then I think it's important to think about when people want, having access to permanent supportive housing and lots of engagement means people are going to be in your face. And so a client might not be super interested in living somewhere where a social worker and a nurse and a money manager might theoretically be knocking on their door, but it could be an appropriate level of care for them. So all about kind of talking to people about what they want to be able to have in the building that they live in, and then kind of, how they will make that work given where they're at. Okay, so the next slide is I swear, very brief discussion of kind of a conversation around eligibility and benefits. So like trigger warning for everybody in the audience who has or is currently or has ever been responsible for helping people get what they need to get housing. Okay. So I'll direct everyone's attention to the person in the bottom in the middle who's doing like this. I think that's to be a placeholder for the frustration and overwhelm and feeling lost that is navigating, attempting to get people housing in San Francisco and everywhere. So kind of navigating the morass of eligibility criteria and applications and timelines and documentation can be truly horrifying and discouraging. That being said, it's a necessary part of supporting a client through their housing journey. And as a provider, role modeling calm and appropriate behavior on the phone with all of these agencies or Social Security, and demonstrating patience and tenacity in the face of this maddening bureaucracy can really be a truly therapeutic and healing process for clients that without your support might have given up. So, there's the Dahlia housing portal to get into the mayor's office and do applications. There's getting people birth certificates and identification. There's making sure people's Social Security and SSI and SSA and SSDI are all up to date. The bottom left is about Section 8 and then the housing authority. So this is all part of housing retention, is supporting people with navigating these agencies and benefits. And it's a necessary evil, but I think it's a real opportunity to build a lot of rapport in working with people on getting access to these things that can help them be more stable in the long term. And here's kind of a fun part. So in your conversation about housing and people's housing stability, it begins with the client and kind of their goals and their preferences and their needs. And you get to have a conversation about what your client's favorite place in the city is. And maybe you can help them find somewhere they like to be. Do they like to hang out in Union Square? Do they like to hang out by the Palace of Fine Arts? Do they like to walk across the Golden Gate Bridge, or just hang out in the Civic Center, or sit and watch the train cars? Talking about housing is an opportunity to talk about your client's life and where they want to be and where they see themselves. And now for the fun part. I guess literally. So, part of housing retention is helping clients identify ways to spend their time that they find meaningful and fulfilling. This is where you get to be creative and inquisitive, asking your clients what they enjoy, what their hobbies are, what things they're interested in, or what they'd like to learn. The pandemic has changed a lot of how all of us spend our time. I think this Zoom training being an apt case in point. So as San Francisco starts to open up, things like adult day health centers, in-person support groups, 12-step groups, game nights, dinner parties, and simply taking walks might be an increasingly real option. But it's another thing that helps identify what housing option is going to be good and how people might stay stable in housing. Because once you get someone housing, that's awesome, but you want to help them have a life outside of that too. And another thing is that safety in the home is a big part of housing retention. So CHIPS and Home Safe and CLF can help frail and elderly folks make adjustments to their homes to diminish falls and decrease risk, which is a big factor, especially with our population that has more than half the population in housing now is seniors. Okay, Elephant Guy's back. We're at the next spot for knowing your options and talking about the San Francisco ecosystem of care. We're kind of flying through stuff, so wanted to see, we'll take a little break here and see if anyone has any questions or comments.
We're good on this side.
Okay, all right. So I suppose I can slow up a little bit, huh?
We can take a stretch.
What
Lot to think about. Yeah.
do you say?
I said there's a lot to think about. There's a lot of information that's sort of coming out, and I think it's trying to figure it out how to make it relevant to each of the different places that our participants are coming from. And so I'm hoping that this is actually getting people thinking about helping someone with regard to housing in a way that's a little bit more conducive to a broader way of addressing the issues of why they're homeless to begin with.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that we're not always feeling at a point where as soon as somebody says housing, we basically shut the door and say, there's nothing I can do about it for you.
Yeah.
When in fact, there's a lot. And I think that's the main point that's being made here. And thanks, Ashley, for doing such a great job with that. That sometimes it is just the tip of the iceberg when they say, I don't have housing. And when you actually delve deeper into assessing the causations and the reasons and the manifestations of it, that you actually find all sorts of other possibilities of attending to what the client is really asking for, which from what we've seen sometimes, it's a better life. I mean, as simple as, or a safer life. So, yeah.
Awesome. Well, you know what? I do have a lot of breaks for discussion. And I think honestly, it's probably better we end up with more time than less. Because once we get to the next part of bringing it all together, I think there's not that many slides after that, but there are lots of concepts. So we'll just see where we land. Okay, so next we'll talk about the options. And we'll talk about the San Francisco ecosystem of care. Okay, so this is one part of a large and mostly overwhelming graph of all of the things that San Francisco offers as far as care, from urgent and emergent care all the way to recovery and wellness. So the last training, we specifically focused on mental health and substance use. And so this one, we are looking just at housing. And so I'll walk you through. On the far left side, we have urgent and emergent. So this is like hair on fire, crisis level, I need help now kind of thing. So the street, so this is people living on the street, living in a car, living in an encampment, or accessing the San Francisco ecosystem of care through a resource center or an emergency shelter. And then once people kind of hit the system in that way, they can move into services at those places. So there's shelter services and navigation centers. stabilization rooms, transitional housing, and getting access to housing navigation services. And then once people are engaged with those, they can move on to permanent supportive housing, cooperative living, housing stabilization services through the city, and long-term kind of rental subsidies. And so generally people access this through coordinated entry, and I'll go over that in just a second. And then another way people access this is through the Behavioral Health Access Center, but that's normally just for mental health and substance use. Okay, so I think I'll zoom in here to talk about coordinated entry. Okay, so coordinated entry was formerly, is now, coordinated entry used to be DA, direct access to housing. And it used to be a way to get kind of the most vulnerable San Franciscans that had had long histories of hospitalizations or homelessness up out off the street and into safe housing so that they could become more stable and stop the kind of revolving door of being on the street or in the ICU or in jail or in PES, and kind of really stabilize people and get them access to things. Coordinated entry has taken over that and has now become the kind of one-stop shop for anyone who is wanting to exit housing or exit homelessness into housing offered through San Francisco. And so coordinated entry has access to assessments and problem solving and prioritizing and referrals. So that means if you are a person or a family seeking help, or you live in an encampment, or if you live out somewhere and the homeless outreach team comes to meet with you, or you're leaving a hospital or a jail, you can go through coordinated entry and get an assessment. And so this would be where people can go to an access point, which I'll talk about in a second, and get an assessment. You get entered into the one system, which is like this kind of centralized system where they can see people's history of housing and homelessness and identify solutions. So that's where problem solving comes in. That's a service offered by coordinated entry. And so problem solving is a way for coordinated entry to help someone fix their homelessness problem ASAP. And then this assessment also allows a person to either be prioritized for rapid rehousing or not. And then if people are prioritized for rapid rehousing, that means they can kind of get fast tracked into housing and permanent supportive housing. And then get into other kind of ongoing housing after that. So you see that there's kind of multiple ways people can get into coordinated entry. And then if people are prioritized, they can get rapidly rehoused and access to permanent supportive housing, and then onto the housing ladder, which is like onto housing that might not be subsidized. And then people can exit and go to temporary shelter and housed on their own, or kind of cycle in and out of the system. So that's coordinated entry kind of in a nutshell. And then so if you have a client that is currently homeless, you can always ask for outreach from the San Francisco Homeless Outreach Team, or SF HOT team. Call 311 or you call this number. And that is where they will go out to wherever the person is and outreach them and bring them either to an access point or to a safe place. And then these are 2 access points where if you have a client that is homeless and can navigate to these places, they can go and get that assessment and get put into the system and get access to a navigation center or a shelter. And yeah, so these are kind of the 2 main points. And if you go to the HSH website, which I have at the end, there's a resource list. This is a way people can access shelter. Okay, so these are the navigation centers. So another navigation center that we talked about in the last training was Hummingbird Psychiatric Respite. And so that's a navigation center at the Mental Health Rehabilitation Center down by right next to General Hospital. And so that is a drop-in 10 a.m. to 6 p.m. There's also overnight beds, but that's mostly attempting to support people that are struggling with psychiatric issues. But it is still a navigation center and can be part of this coordinated entry navigation center model. And So there's 9 navigation centers across the city. COVID's impacted some of their availability, but these are 6 of those. So the navigation centers are low threshold, high service, temporary shelter programs for adults experiencing homelessness in San Francisco. And so they're part of the homeless response system, and they're an attractive service for people living unsheltered or in encampments. And they do not accept walk-ins. So all individuals and couples who enter have been selected by the homeless outreach team or a centralized referring system. So they would have gone into one of those access points that you saw on the previous slide. And because navigation centers operate 24 hours a day, there's not lines outside, and guests aren't exited onto the street in the morning, which is something that we saw with other shelters. You can see these are like really set up to be nice and inviting places. So if you have someone that's on the street and is not 100% sure about whether or not they want to jump full into going into a shelter, you might encourage them to call the homeless outreach team or go to one of these access points to see if they want to give a navigation center a try.
Actually, there's a question
Yeah.
very related to the last point, Ashley. So from Allison Sallow, the question is, can the outreach team work with individuals who have been evicted but are effectively squatting and not yet on the street and homeless?
I think if someone is in imminent risk of homelessness, that's what the homeless outreach team is for.
Okay.
Like, yeah. I think it's always a good option for the homeless outreach team to know about someone, because if they're not exactly homeless right now today, it's better that they know about the person and like what they look like and where they might be found, so that if they become homeless, they have a better and more kind of immediate way of accessing that person. They'll ask you what they look like, what they wear, where they normally spend time.
Okay.
Awesome.
Thanks.
So maybe what we'll do is I'll go through the rest of the housing options, and then we'll take a little break and come back before we tie it all together. Okay.
And we have a few questions saved for that too. Yeah.
Okay, great. All right. So these are transitional and cooperative living. So some folks might go into a navigation center, they might go to a shelter, and then they're like, okay, I think I've got this housing thing down. I think I'm living inside is okay. I want to figure out something else. I want to move on to the next step. And there's lots of different options within that. So this is not an exhaustive list of all the transitional housing options in San Francisco, but just some things to think about. The Washburn is a 2-year transitional program that is housing, yes, but it also has services. So there are case managers on site, they run groups, and there's an expectation that people participate in outside activities. COVID's probably changed a lot of that, but it's not just a house that you get to live in for 2 years, it's a house you get to live in for 2 years, and there's a requirement that you engage with the staff to some extent. Bigger Places also offers a supported independent living where there will be a requirement that you participate with the community that you're in. Progress Foundation has residential programs and also cooperative living where there'll be, a house meeting or something. And then sober living environments is a pretty common way for people to transition from either detox or a residential program into an environment where everyone is attempting to be sober. And then Health Right 360 runs a bunch of sober living environments. Then there's also residential treatment. And so there's residential treatment specifically for mental health. There's residential treatment for what we call dual diagnosis for mental health and substance use. There's also residential treatment just for substance use. And so there are programs that are 60 days, 90 days, and 12 months long, where people will they'll live somewhere. Most programs require you to have a roommate. Most programs will require you to pay fees. Most programs will require you to do therapy and do group therapy and do chores and cook and all this kind of stuff, but it will offer you somewhere to live. So this can be a really good transitional place for people to figure out what their next step is, stabilize mental health symptoms, get support with substance use, learn about how to live indoors or just how to live on their own. Because some people who have been living in, let's say, a hospital can transition from a hospital or institution into a transitional environment and learn coping skills and independent living skills with the support of staff so that they can transition into a more independent option in the future. And next we'll cover the kind of permanent supportive housing options. I think that will be question and break time. Okay. So these are a few permanent supportive housing buildings. So clients might choose to move from transitional housing to PSH or permanent supportive housing. And so there's many permanent supportive housing agencies through San Francisco, and they're mostly a combination of different nonprofits. And so different nonprofits will run the social work services or the medication or the nursing services or the money management and property management. And so normally there's a complicated overlap of contracts and relationships within each of the buildings. And so some permanent supportive housing buildings will have lots of services, some will have very few, and it's largely dependent on agency policy and contract. And so these are some of the larger buildings in San Francisco. Top left is Bayview Hill Gardens down in the Bayview. The right side one is the Rene Casanave in downtown on First by the water. And then bottom left is Kelly Cullen at Leavenworth and Golden Gate. And then the other one is a TNDC building in the Tenderloin. So these are some of like the big permanent supportive housing options. All of these will have social work in the building. Some have nursing, but they will all have support kind of Monday to Friday, 9 to 5. Everyone has their own individual apartment. And yeah, so it's an option people pursue. And everyone, signs their own individual lease, and services are voluntary. So people can work with the services in the building and they can also refuse. I suppose I'll also mention long-term care here. So permanent supportive housing is a great kind of permanent option for people. And it also might not be the end point for folks. So some people move into permanent supportive housing and it is still not enough care. So permanent supportive housing is a great option for people, but there are sometimes folks that need medical support that is above what can be done in a supportive housing building. And so people might transition from there to a skilled nursing facility or a residential care facility. And so an RCF or a skilled nursing facility means that people require support with their activities of daily living. So they'll need help with hygiene and laundry, or someone to feed them, and supervision and help with medication that kind of can't be done even with lots of services brought into an independent living environment. With that, options like skilled nursing facilities and RCF beds are kind of few and far between. There's lots of complicated factors that make access pretty challenging. They also, residential care facility beds tend to be for folks that have kind of ongoing psych issues. And to get there normally requires SSI and a payee. But long-term care is an option. It's a thing that is also good to think about when you're working with clients. Can we create a plan for this person that will meet their needs, or should we be looking for a longer-term custodial program like a residential care facility, or is this someone that actually may need a nursing level of care? So it's always good to have a care team and all that good stuff. Okay, so we are at the bringing it all together part. And I suppose we'll maybe take a break here for a couple minutes and then come back and we'll move into a discussion of housing retention issues and kind of go over what the issues are and then move into what we do around it. So you want to say we take, I don't know, 2-3 minutes? Does that sound good, Anne?
Sounds good. Yeah, we do. We are saving the questions
Okay.
for later discussion and also some clarification questions, so we can do that. Let's see. Well, there's a question from Allison. Any thoughts on working with clients whose behavioral health symptoms prohibit them from calling or going to the coordinated entry or the San Francisco Behavioral Health Service access points? What would be the suggestions for those people?
Okay, are we gonna do questions now or after the break?
After the break, but
Okay. So let's see, it's
So-
1:27. Why don't we come back at 1:30?
Perfect.
All right.
Okay.
Thanks everyone for being here today. This is Catlin Moore. We're just taking a quick break, but as please feel free to pose further questions in either the Q&A or the chat feature, and we will collect those and Ann Almondral will pose them to Ashley Mooney later. Thank you. And since some of you joined a little bit later, I will reiterate that continuing education units will be delivered after this training within 10 working days. And there is also, and there's information about that in the chat feature if you scroll up. And there is also a survey that Ashley and Ann will place in the chat feature towards the end of this program. And we would appreciate it if you would take that SurveyMonkey survey at the end of today's training. You'll see that link later. Thank you.
Hello.
Okay.
All right, ready for questions.
All right. We just, all right. So the first one, the thoughts around working with people who have behavioral health symptoms that don't allow them to call or access or even go to the coordinated entry or the San Francisco Behavioral Health Services access points. Any thoughts around how best to make sure that their housing needs are met?
Yeah, I'd say the homeless outreach team is probably a good person to go. It seems like they need hand holding, right? It's like they can get the information, but they're not physically going to get there unless there's someone with them. I think the homeless outreach team is probably a good resource, because you call them and say, I know this person, this is the relationship that I have with them. They tend to be here. The homeless outreach team has capacity to go. And what they will often do is sometimes they can do the assessment. The assessment's not long. I've sat with people who have done it. It's just a few minutes long. And so they can do the assessment in the field. And then, if the person's prioritized for housing, they can take them somewhere, or if they're not, they can problem solve with them right then. And then I think this is kind of bridging between housing and behavioral health, but I think the roving team is a team run by UCSF through Citywide that specifically works on connecting people with behavioral health symptoms that are challenging to engage and are having difficulty accessing psychiatric care. And their whole job, they call them the roving team because they literally rove around the city trying to wrangle people that are hard to wrangle. So I'd say the homeless outreach team is probably the best bet for going to engage someone that's difficult to engage if you're attempting to get them into housing. Another option would be the UCSF roving team through Citywide.
Yeah, I think additionally, I've also run into situations where clients who have ongoing case management relationships with a lot of our partner agencies are able to assist clients in applying for housing when there is, particularly if there's a language or cultural trust issue. It seems that the community-based case managers are able to facilitate that process as well. Okay, another question is
Oh,
go ahead.
I think I had a thought, but then I think it went away. It'll come back.
It'll come back. Okay. This one is from Sylvia. She's just interested in getting the information. Oh, no, sorry. There are two other questions. This one is from Sylvia. If someone is homeless and wants to be housed, what is the preferred way to refer them? To the SF hot team or to the coordinated entry? If they're
like both, right? It just depends. If the person cannot navigate to the access points and would need the outreach team to go to outreach them, then that would be the option. If the person can get to the access points, I think that's probably the recommended. It just depends on what your client's capacity is. If they need someone to physically go to them, like they're not going to go, or they cannot get themselves to those access points, that outreach team would probably be your best bet. And the outreach team also can advise you as to what probably is going to be the most effective, because I think the outreach team also knows, because they're all in the same system, they can track which navigation center and shelter has beds and has access. So they might be able to give people the kind of up-to-date information about where best to point people.
Okay, great, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Question is more informational from Anna Schmidt. She would like to get the addresses and contact numbers for the permanent supportive housing programs, and you might have that at the end.
So
if not, we can probably provide that.
Yeah, those are great question. Those are also, it kind of doesn't work that way. I can tell you where the building is, and you can walk up to the building being like, here is my person, and they are going to tell you to go away. So because permanent supportive housing is through coordinated entry and through all of these kind of contracts and processes, you can't just send someone there. They have to be part of a referral network, which is why coordinated entry has kind of taken on this kind of clearinghouse role. So I think if you're wanting to get someone into permanent supportive housing through coordinated entry and have them end up in, like in a permanent supportive housing unit, like at the Renee Casanave or Kelly Cullen, they need to get the coordinated entry assessment done. And so they need to go through the access point, get the assessment done, be in the system, and then they get funneled into the various different permanent supportive housing options.
I think that's what we had, unless there are people who have questions, if you can put it in the Q&A or in the chat, then we'll try to address them as well.
Awesome. I'm sure more will come up because this is
Okay.
kind of where we're like linking all of these kind of pieces together.
Alrighty.
Okay, so chat discussion. So I'm going to show a table now of, well, now, going to show a table now of, this is kind of the major buckets of housing retention problems. So these are the kind of major things that cause people to lose housing or either not go into housing or lose housing or be unstably housed. Like I said, I'm sure everyone in this room can think of things that are not on this list, and I'm not claiming to be the expert in knowing all of this, but kind of overall major things that tend to show up for people: self-care, behavior, rent. So within self-care, so when considering how issues might impact housing, it's kind of important to think if the issue impacts the individual, so like just that person inside of their apartment, the immediate community, so like their neighbors next door and upstairs and downstairs, the larger community like the building, or the larger community like the neighborhood, because the interventions kind of are different depending on where they're aimed. And you know, safety planning is different depending on which issue kind of is involved and how it impacts the person. Like generally self-care issues tend to really only put the individual at risk. So generally they're at risk of hospitalization or, you know, failing inspections or habitability concerns in their apartment. So those individual self-care issues tend to only be a problem for them unless the person's responsible for caring for someone else or a pet. And a lot of those needs can be met by, you know, more outreach or in-home care. The other ones like behavior and rent can impact, we know behavior can definitely impact the outside community. Rent tends to also just be the person. So within self-care, there's managing psychiatric symptoms and engaging with care. There's managing medical conditions, both acute medical conditions and chronic medical conditions. There's nutrition, both getting the food and getting it into the person. And then housekeeping. It's kind of all encompassing how to manage an apartment by yourself, or how to manage an apartment in the context of having multiple kind of complicated problems. So behavior, some of these are obviously self-care related, but we'll look at behavior kind of in the way that it affects when you live with people. So with behavior, we see substance use problems, violence, interpersonal conflict, and property damage. So these are like how a person's self-care or not can impact the people around them. And that's a large part of housing harm reduction is, okay, what are you doing? And then how is it impacting you or the people that are near you? And then rent is non-payment, late payment, and underpayment. So I know back in the beginning, we saw that many San Franciscans own, but a lot rent. And we know that San Francisco is an expensive place to live. And so there's a lot of people who are devoting way more than, you know, a third or half of their income. Sometimes it's almost all of their income or all, or more than their income. And so underpayment of rent is kind of like an ongoing thing. And all three of these things kind of contribute to housing retention issues. So question posed to the group: how do we think these things might impact folks' housing? I never get phone calls except for right now. Did anyone have anything in the chat for how these things impact housing yet? I guess we can give people a minute.
Well, there's a comment from Amanda Perez saying risk of it and or hospitalization.
Yep.
Would be a risk, unable to, Sylvia says, unable to comply with the terms of the lease.
Beautiful.
Yeah, for whatever reason. And let's see. But there's a side question actually that has to
Okay.
do with how long the wait list time is after a person has completed the coordinated entry application.
That depends on a lot of things. Yeah, I unfortunately don't have a clear answer, but I can tell you it depends on which building they're going to, like which building which contract their kind of housing is under. It also depends on what availability in the building is like. And yeah, it's like a multifaceted question. I might call coordinated entry and ask, but
Directly, okay.
yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, yeah, I think that's what
Is it? Okay.
yeah. Mhm.
Okay. So let's go over the eviction process. And so this eviction process is mostly based on, so my experience has been in permanent supportive housing. So I personally have worked at the Renee Casanave and Kelly Cullen. And so those are permanent supportive housing buildings with social workers in the building, sometimes nurses, sometimes social workers, nurses, sometimes money management. And so in those buildings, there's a property management team and a social work team. And there's kind of a collaborative effort to support housing retention in that. And so based on that experience and kind of the overall eviction process, this is kind of how it goes. So first, there's an event. So I got broken glass here because I guess we'll pick that someone broke something in the building. So it's a kind of major event, major property damage. Could also be conflict, could be police or EMS involvement, right? So it's not just that someone causes a problem. It could be that they're very sick. And so normally there's something that happens, and because most of these buildings have front desk staff, it gets documented in some way, and that kind of starts not the eviction process, but starts the process of bringing an issue to the attention of the people that are responsible for supporting this client. So let's say it's a major conflict resulting in property damage or something. There's a fight and stuff gets broken, police show up, kind of a big thing. So first is the major event. Then next is outreach and engagement. So in a permanent supportive housing building, there's generally an outreach letter. So like the desk clerk will write something saying, hey, this event happened, Friday at 3 a.m. And, police came and there was a fight and there's property damage. And then the social worker, the case manager will outreach to the person. There'll be a letter written by the property manager and the social worker will outreach saying, hey, this thing happened. What do you want to do? And
actually,
yeah,
there is a comment that in addition to what you mentioned, a critical event, basically, there's also housekeeping is always a challenge. This is Daisy Dang.
Yep.
Housekeeping is always a challenge. Some tenants refuse to clean their units or get support for keeping their house clean. That makes a lot of complaints from their neighbors.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Thank you for that.
A clarification question to your last statement, which from Paul, which is, are you referring to Section 8 housing, which is state supported rent?
Yes. And I mean, yeah, there's like tons of different subsidized, like people can live in housing that's subsidized through all different types of things, right? Someone can live in Section 8 and so they get their voucher they get a Section 8 voucher. People can also live in housing that is subsidized through what used to be done. So 50% of their unit is subsidized. There's subsidized housing where they pay 30%. So it depends on lots of different factors. Yeah, so but the kind of overall process looks more or less similar to this. And totally right with the habitability and the inspections and the housekeeping, right? People don't have the skills to manage inside of an apartment and or know how to or want to clean or any combination therein. And they also don't want to accept help. And that causes major problems in housing because their apartment smells bad. There's bugs, there's yeah, all types of really gross stuff that can happen, and it causes their neighbors lots of problems and causes them problems. Yeah, thanks for that. And this process can kind of happen because of that as well. So with this, to make it like those kind of habitability ones are a little less cut and dry because there's kind of lots of factors that might make someone not clean their apartment. Same thing with conflict, but to make this eviction process a little more clear, we're going to make it so it's like kind of a dangerous thing. So let's say there's a big fight and there's property damage and there's a big fight, and this person tends to have a nasty habit of getting in fights with people. So the outreach letter would be the beginning. And then if the fight thing kind of continues, there could be a behavior contract that happens. Case conferences is also a thing that can happen to really help either the person, navigate the relationship with someone that they're fighting with, or just make sure that the person is aware that like this is a problem. And then the next step is a 3-day or a 10-day warning to cure. So this is kind of like legal speak. 3-day and 10-day means from the day you get this letter, you have 3 days to not repeat the behavior. If it's a letter to cure, right? A letter to cure means you can fix this. You can cure this problem if the problem doesn't happen again within this window. So a 3-day, 10-day warning to cure means there's a problem and we will work with you on it. Nothing else will happen if this no longer happens, right? So if there's a fight and there's an outreach letter, they get a 3-day warning and they don't get into a fight for 3 days, everything goes back to normal, slate's clean. If, however, something else happens, the process can continue. So if someone violates their lease, they can get what's called a lease violation. And lease violation is a very solid piece of paperwork that says you have violated your lease. And multiple lease violations can result in eviction. Not in all cases, but can. And then other kind of punitive things. So lease violations are kind of punitive, hence the stick. There's also suspension of visitor privileges, right? So people can have their overnight visits either taken away entirely or diminished, or visitors taken away. And then the other thing is like a 3-day or 10-day warning to quit, as opposed to a warning to cure. There's a warning to quit, which means if within those 3 or 10 days you continue this behavior, the eviction process is going to move forwards. And so no one ever really wants to see one of those, but that's can be part of the eviction process. And then after that, there can be other contracts people sign. So if people are not paying rent, people can develop a payment plan, and that can get you out of any of the eviction things as long as you document, as long as you're working with the client and the property manager have something in paper saying you're behind in rent, but there's this plan and we're working on this plan. That can get you out of the danger zone with rental issues. And then there's a stipulated agreement, which is like a court document saying it's like a behavioral contract, but it's at the legal level. And so those are things that people need to adhere to, because if you don't, eviction can be the next thing. So I'm not a lawyer and there are attorneys on here, so feel free to correct me. Just trying to give an overview here.
Yes,
What can
actually,
happen?
there are a couple of statements and also a question of clarification. What age group are you referring to here? That's the question.
These are all adults.
All adults, including all adults. And then the points from Harris Coleman is in San Francisco, whenever a client is at risk of eviction, an APS report can be made.
Yep.
And APS can definitely assist with the eviction. And Patricia mentions that there is now a moratorium still of eviction.
Yep.
For people who are not able to live peacefully in an apartment building with other people because of his drug addiction. Well, I don't know, maybe a clarification on that then. So the statement is there's a moratorium now. So how do you evict someone who is not able to live peacefully in an apartment building with other people because of his drug addiction? That's the question.
Well, I'm not a lawyer, so I cannot tell you how to evict someone, but I can tell you, this is not intended to be like a how-to on the eviction process, mostly so that when you have clients that have documents like a 3-day warning or a 10-day warning, you kind of know where that falls and what that might mean. Also, people can be in lots of places in this process and it stops. Like there's a lot of discretion, I think, in this whole process. And I think also COVID's really changed whether or not property managers or landlords continue with evictions, especially given that there's a moratorium and given that the courts were backlogged before everything shut down. So I think in order to maybe head off lots of these things, getting your client involved, getting your client connected to RADCO or eviction defense or APS to really work on problem solving before it gets to any of these things like an eviction process. And we'll get to that in a second when we talk about our safety plan and kind of problem solving around how to get people supports to enhance their housing.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay. Any clarifying other questions?
Well, I think we're good for now.
Okie dokie. So this is just an example guy. We talked about Jerry before. We're not really gonna we're not gonna work through his case, but just like an example. And I think that I'm kind of like a visual person. And so this little visual helped me kind of unpack what I think kind of housing harm reduction can be. So Jerry is a 62-year-old Caucasian heterosexual male living alone in permanent supportive housing in the Tenderloin. Most of your clients won't have a diagnosis, but Jerry does. Jerry carries a diagnosis of schizophrenia from a psychiatrist. Jerry also has diabetes and likes to use alcohol and crack cocaine. Jerry usually has a belief that everyone outside of his Meals on Wheels delivery person and his Homebridge providers are aliens that are out to get him. He uses about 2 pints of vodka and $10 of crack. Jerry is on SSI and is a third-party payee that pays his rent, with the balance coming to him around the 5th of each month. So this is the little visual I thought. So when I think about a housing retention plan, these are kind of many of the issues that can go on. And I like to think about a case and think, okay, here are all of the issues that can happen. Which are the most pressing for this person? And which is going to be the one that's going to be a problem kind of the most quickly. And that's kind of how I like to approach making a safety plan. And so we see Jerry he's got a mental health issue. He has substance use issue. He's got money, seems like, and his money is not a particular issue because his rent's paid. Seems like he's got food and care, but with that mental health issue, that might be something that he refuses at some point. So lots of things to think about as far as safety planning with Jerry. But this is kind of an overall description of a housing retention safety plan. So you kind of want to be thinking like, what behavior is the focus of my conversation or concern and why? And then like, what stage of change is my client in around this behavior? So first you want to identify the major risk, right? So which of these many problems that this client has is likely to be the most dangerous and most likely? Yeah, so what behavior is the focus of my concern? And then protecting against the worst outcome, right? There's like lots of different directions our clients can go in because there's lots of different problems, but like which one are they going in the direction fastest? And when I talk to them about that, are they concerned about this behavior? Are they aware or thinking about the consequences of their behavior? And what do they think of those consequences? And, you know, what can I as a provider do to help them avoid the worst case scenario? And then enhancing stability. So what can I do to shore up supports to help my client stay stable? And then connect with resources. So how do I connect my client with things they need if things get worse? So this is a safety plan, and it's all, yeah, from a harm reduction lens of, okay, I want this person to be safe, and I want to protect them from the scariest thing that I think might happen. And, you know, I can't make their decisions for them. I can't protect them from everything, but how do I cover my bases by considering all of the options and protecting them as much as I can? So now we have another discussion. So my discussion question is, what role does trauma play in housing and housing retention? So I can kind of talk about some things that I was thinking about while people are adding their thoughts. So housing brings up lots and lots of different stuff. So we've got the police lights, because housing sometimes involves kind of crime and punishment and interactions with police. Housing also can involve consequences for, oh, sorry, are you saying something?
There's
Yeah.
a request to repeat the question so they can.
Oh, yeah. What role does trauma play in housing and housing retention?
And you've got a couple of answers. Basically, it impacts all aspects of housing. Trauma can affect the inability, can cause the inability to trust others or the system. I would say that trauma is part of the negative cycle for people who struggle with housing. And Chris mentions feeling of jumping through hoops, worthlessness. And Charlie mentions trauma is equal to the lack of overall stability, and also impacts their reactions to assistance, I would think.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, I mean, housing brings up consequences for behavior, right? This fear of loss, this fear of rejection, this shame. People make a mistake in housing, and if you lived in your own apartment and something bad happened, maybe no one would know. But if you make a mistake and you relapse or something, and you're out in the middle of your lobby being high or something, everyone knows, right? There's shame and fear and rejection. This is also deep stuff around learning and early attachment, right? Relating to others and communication skills and access to education, right? Maybe our clients were never trained on how to talk to each other, or on how to talk to people. In housing, you put people in close quarters. There's also safety and security, right? Privacy, doors and locks. Housing also brings up a lot of issues about kind of resources and access to money and goods and services and food, and legal and illegal behavior. And so, like, ways of spending time together.
Actually, this brings to an earlier point, Ashley, around the question with certain people choosing to live in their vehicles, whether it's a car, a van, or I guess an RV would be a possibility. The question of why would it be urgent or emergent, because it could be a matter of choice for the people who live in their vehicles. Some people do not want a permanent living situation. That was one comment that was made earlier.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that's what I said in the very beginning, was like, home means something different for each person. And that putting the street and an encampment in a vehicle is all urgent and emergent as assessed by the city of San Francisco, and not me.
Yeah.
I think that's kind of why when we started, I was asking what success means in housing, because it doesn't mean the same thing for me as it would for a client, and it's all about kind of their core values. So I totally agree with whoever it was that shared that.
Yeah, and then a comment about that a client may be triggered by a neighbor's behavior, mental health related behavior.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I think the other issue, and I'm not sure exactly how it fits in the line of our discussion here, but racism and ethnocentricity definitely has a factor in how people feel safe in their houses and what they choose. And I don't know how that kind of gets woven into sorting out safety for people, the perception of safety when it's related to ethnocentricity or racism.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, thank you guys for that. Yeah, housing is a loaded thing. So Now we'll move into a little brief motivational interviewing kind of training, because a lot of helping people with housing is helping people figure out where they're at with the stages of change. I'm not going to read these to you because I'm fairly certain this is, I imagine it's, if it's review, and if it's not, you'll have the slides after. But motivational interview is a really good way to have a conversation about housing stuff. And so the major things we want to talk about are asking open-ended questions, not did you clean your apartment today, but what is your plan for cleaning your apartment? Did you take your meds is not as good as what's your plan around managing your blood pressure. Affirmations, giving people praise. Our clients hear all of the time what they're doing badly and what they cannot do and what they should be doing. And sometimes we're the only person that tells them that they're good at something, that they accomplished something. And it's really important that we point out when people succeed, even if it is very, very small. Reflections, sometimes finding words to put to other people's experience is really hard. And sometimes you don't have to, you can just say what they said to you, and that's just as powerful. And summaries, our clients are really complicated and they feel lots of feelings and they're telling us lots of stuff. And sometimes it can be really, really powerful just to say, I'm going to just try and encapsulate everything that you told me. You tell me if I missed something, and just hand back what they've said. Those are the kind of core things you want to be doing when you're having a conversation with someone around housing retention or kind of any behavior or issue, but something to think about. So then the next thing for motivational interviewing is change talk. So change talk is people talking about making change. So when we think about change talk, we want to think about that darn cat. And so hence the cat. So darn cat is desire, ability, reasons, and need. And cat is commitment, activation, or preparation, and taking steps. So when we're thinking about talking to clients around housing retention problems or any kind of major issues, we want to be thinking about, how do I encourage them to talk about these things? Why they want to change? Do they want to change? What do they need to change for? And then, if they're like, today's the day I got to do less crack, like, all right, that's a commitment. What steps can we take that can really kind of spool up their motivation and keep them kind of moving forwards? So I know folks are often wanting specific questions, like, what do I say? What do I ask to get these things to happen, to have this conversation? Here's a list. So you want to explore a decisional balance, which is really looking at the pros and cons of making a change or not. You can also look at the good things or not so good things. So what are the good things about not cleaning your apartment? What are the not so good things? We'll just take the cleaning your apartment thing. We doing lots of speed, right? What is the good things of doing lots of speed, and what are the not so good things? Because people do things for a reason. It's very rare that a behavior has no positive benefits for people. So it's our kind of role to say, well, what are you getting out of this? And what is, not so great about it? Looking back and looking forwards around a problem, right? Like, do you remember a time before this issue happened? And what were the things like? Do you remember, like, what, and if you look forwards, right? If you imagine this problem did not exist, what would things be like? What would you feel like? And then query the extremes if this problem continues. Okay, let's say nothing changes about your behavior. What's this going to look like 10 years from now? What's this going to look like 20 years from now? What's this going to look like a week from now if nothing about this changes? Or if this changes right now and a miracle happens, what's the best thing that could happen? And then another is a readiness to change ruler, right? Like, on a scale from 1 to 10, how ready are you to do something different about this? Because some days people are like, I am 100% in, let's fix it now. And some days they're not. And it can be helpful to say, okay, well, last week you were at like a 6 and now you're at a 2. what's the difference? Like what changed? Or when people come in saying, I'm ready to change right now. Okay, yes, great. What is making right now an important time to make that change? And then exploring the goals and values, right? Like someone comes in saying, I need to change everything about my life today. Well, what is important to you that's making that urgency happen? Because these conversations would be helpful to have, because if a client all of a sudden takes a hard left and is like, nope, I don't want to do that anymore, you now have a conversation to say, hey, I'm seeing right now you don't want to do anything about that, but like 2 weeks ago you said it was really important to you to keep this apartment so your sister could come visit, but now you're saying you don't care anymore. Like, I'm wondering what happened. Is that not important? And then finally, you can come alongside, which means, if a client's in a place of not changing, you're not necessarily like agreeing, but you're saying maybe now isn't the time to change. And then you're, aligning with the person to say, okay, we're in this together. How are we going to make this work, given that maybe now isn't the time? So these are all open-ended questions to help you really get a picture of where your client's at. And it's very much based in the client telling you what is important.
Yeah, and you have a comment from Chris Libenau that I really love the questions, the list of questions. Thanks for reviewing these in depth. Really touches on the way that we might continually engage with someone who tells you that housing is the issue. I think there's also a side comment related to the CAREN Act. This is the CAREN Act, which is the Caution Against Racially Exploitative Non-Emergency 911 Calls. Because I guess sometime, and I'm not familiar with it now, but Harris Coleman mentions that San Francisco now has made placing a racist 911 call a hate crime. So somebody might be calling 911 complaining about their neighbor who is of another race, let's say, that is now considered a hate crime. And
wow.
So, yeah, I guess it's a pretty recent decision on the part of the Board of Supervisors, but it's one that I've not heard of. But thank you for that. Okay.
Awesome. Thank you.
Oh, October 2020. That was when it was brought in. Thank you.
All right. So let's see. We are on slide 39 of 44, but the last two are not real slides. So these last three are just going to be putting it all together on how do we keep these people housed? Because we go till 2:30, right? And I think that should put us right at time, huh?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So the owl is just like, hey, think about questions, but I think we'll just push through to the end and do questions then. All right. So how do we keep this person housed? I invite you to think that it might not be whether or not the behavior stops, but if it decreases or impacts others less. So these are all the kind of options of like, what do I do when these problems are happening for people? So far left is behavioral health. So behavioral health, the list of options are EMS 6 is a medical team that's a combination of paramedics and paramedics and fire team that work with people who cycle in and out of the ERs. And so it's a really good team to refer people to if they're constantly using emergency medical care. DUCC stands for Door Urgent Care Clinic. It's a drop-in clinic. It's open 24 hours a day for people who think they need to go to the psych hospital or psych emergency, but maybe don't want to go to PES or maybe don't need that level of care. It's meant to divert people away from PES. APS is also a great option if you have someone that's struggling with behavioral health, self-neglect, teetering on grave disability. Behavioral health also is substance use, right? So I've got BART, clinics, Ward 93, Ford Help, Sobering Center. I think Homebridge and IHSS are really big kind of stop gaps for supporting people that are struggling with mental health and substance use because they provide really important in-home care. So that's caring for either hygiene or just doing the habitability stuff, that housekeeping stuff, that if people are not physically or mentally well, they take care of that. I think also Homebridge and IHSS provide companionship and supervision and linkage to case managers in case people are not feeling well and might need to get access to different levels of care. Food, and then I think supporting people with behavioral health. So that's substance use stuff can be supporting them with refusal skills, helping them identify what they feel around substance use and linking them to the supports that will help. And along that line, there's residential treatment, and TAP is Treatment Access Program, and the Behavioral Health Access Center. So with violence, getting DV resources, and supporting people with conflict and conflict resolution and communication skills. And, that's linking someone to case management if they don't already have it, and helping them get an advocate if they're in a DV situation, or if they're not in a DV situation and they're just someone who struggles with communicating, like helping them get someone who can form a relationship with them so they can get the support that they need. So then with conflict, again, there's the kind of overall bringing up someone's skill set, but then if people are having conflicts within a building, there's advocacy that can be done there. So people can get a reasonable accommodation to move to a different unit in a building. If they're like having a fight with their neighbor that is never going to resolve, seeing if there's a way to move them. And then if there's like an ongoing conflict, helping people with SFPD reports and all that stuff, and then doing case conferences and making a care team conference and having mediations to really help people navigate conflicts if they have to live together. And then property damage, there's property management case conferences and creating a care team and referring people to case management or a higher level of case management if they don't already have it. And so that I would recommend the IOA and the DOS line, getting people support. And then physical health, obviously linking someone with a primary care provider is going to be a big step. And then, linking people with things like Homebridge and IHSS so they can get them to these people. And obviously a case manager can be a core piece of all of that. And APS can be a good resource for people who are not interested in engaging in that process or are unwell such that they can't. And that's where we might consider looping in an on-site medical team if people are in a permanent supportive housing environment. So again, with a behavior that's impacting like the outer community or the individual, I think there's obviously lots of focus on whether or not you can get the person to stop doing the thing or start doing the thing. But harm reduction, we want to think about maybe we just find a way to make it less bad, right? Bring the floor up a little and slow the pace of the free fall if there's something going on, because that's ultimately going to help reduce risk. Okay, and then rent, kind of money issues are, there's negotiation and planning that can be done around rent, right? So there's getting a release of information for property management, doing case conferences, working on a payment plan, getting people Section 8 vouchers and PSH. So those like word salad down at the bottom is like identifying different funding people can get, right? So it's HUD housing or continuum of care or shelter plus care. Either way, that's going to be a coordinated entry assessment. And then below market rate, that's, monitoring the affordable housing and doing the Dahlia thing. And then with rent, something to think about is that there are formalized supports to help people with rent. There are third-party payee nonprofits that will take charge of people's benefits, and they will get the benefits from Social Security and get them to the client while paying all of their bills. And it can be a really, really helpful support. It is possible to get a client mandated to have a payee. Normally it requires you go through their medical doctor or their psychiatrist, but it can be a really beneficial thing. Have a conversation with the client and say, hey, your money has been an ongoing issue. Let's get you some support with this. And then the doctor can complete paperwork saying this person doesn't really have capacity to manage their money. And then you've got the ability to get them a third-party payee that can really take care of a lot of these things. And there's long-term rental subsidy. And then there's also rescue options, right? Like if they're way behind in rent and they need help right now, there are things like eviction defense, rental subsidies for short-term stuff too. And I think that's all we got. So to close, I'd like to say thank you all for joining us. And yeah, I welcome any questions, comments, concerns. There's our link for an evaluation. I'm next going to turn to our very last slide and highlight that the Clinical Collaborative has 2 trainings coming up. So the next one is going to be, I believe, on May 20th by our third person, which is Rebecca Hunt, our nurse practitioner on our team. And it's going to be about urologic changes in older adults. And then we'll be offering another training in June on aging gracefully. And yeah, thank you all for your time. I'm going to scoot back to our evaluation link and then see if we have any final comments, questions, or concerns.
Well, already it's a bit early, but I'd like to say that this has been a great presentation. Thank you. That's from Paul. Thank you, Paul. And also just returning back to the trauma, that in fact homelessness itself, or becoming homelessness precipitously, can be the trauma. And just to be aware of that, according to Amanda. And okay, I think that's excellent presentation. Thank you from Faraday. Thank you. Thank you for providing another thorough and thoughtful training, organized, straightforward delivery. The animals are a fun touch.
Thanks. They're as much for me as they are for you.
And then the question of, can we transport the Survey Monkey link into the chat so they can.
Yep. Yeah, I can do that right now.
Perfect. Thank you. And let's see. Yeah, I think. Well, thank you so much, everybody, for your attention and your engagement. We continue to feel pretty excited about the kind of community trainings that we're able to provide and partner with Caitlin Morgan, our education manager. When you fill out the surveys, please add additional comments for specific technology stuff or techniques or methods, but also definitely on content that you're interested in and specific topics that you might find interesting in the future. Okay, thank you. All righty. So,
All right, should I stop the recording?
yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Ashley.
Wonderful. Thank you. That's awesome. Round of applause.